So today we are going to look at a reading by Friedrich Engels. So this is from a booklet or a short book called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, written by Friedrich Engels in 1892, as you can see. And I've just retitled it for us to understand how Marx and Engels viewed the French Revolution. So I've retitled it From the Reformation to the French Revolution. So let's look at what Europe was like before the Reformation began. Engels writes, "The great international center of feudalism was the Roman Catholic Church. It united Europe into one grand political system, opposed the schismatic Greeks and Islam, had its own hierarchy on the feudal model, and it owned 1/3 of the soil of the Catholic world." In other words, the Catholic Church was really the institution that held European feudalism together. Any revolution against feudalism to establish capitalism would inevitably then also find itself confronted by the power of the Catholic Church. Already by 1633, as I spoke about in the last lecture, science had rebelled against the Church. We have this image of the trial of Galileo in 1633. Now, this rebellion against the Church in the name of science wasn't necessarily a class rebellion as such, but certainly the class that wanted to increase production in order to earn more profit allied itself to this scientific revolution and wanted to promote it. Now, there were three important characteristics of this anti-feudal revolt that we'll see now will encompass about 200 years of European history. The class most directly interested in the struggle against the pretensions of the Roman Church was first and foremost the bourgeoisie. This is a French word, but all it means is the capitalist class. Okay? In Urdu, we would say sarmayadar. We would also use the term middle class in that particular context, although today's middle class is very different from the middle class of that feudal period. In the feudal period, the middle class were the merchants and the traders who eventually became the bourgeoisie. Every struggle against feudalism, Engels says, at that time had to take on a religious disguise, had to be directed against the church in the first instance. So it was directed against the church in the name of religion, in the name of reforming Christianity, in the name of a protesting Christianity. It had to take on the Catholic Church. Why? Because, as explained previously, the Catholic Church represented really, it was the key institution of European feudalism. And thirdly, universities and the traders of the city started the cry, but it found a strong echo in the peasants. Inevitably, the peasants had to go along with it in order to destroy feudalism. If the peasants were not going along with it, then of course feudalism would remain intact in the countryside, which is where it derived its power from. So these were the three key features. Firstly, that it had to be the bourgeoisie pitted against the church. Secondly, that it had to take on a religious disguise, but the content of it, the form of it was to reform Christianity, but the content of it was really essentially anti-feudal. And thirdly, that the peasantry had to become a part of it. What were the three great decisive battles? The first one is the Protestant Reformation, together with the revolt of the German nobility and then the peasant wars of 1525. The second one is the English Revolution, also the Cromwellian Revolution, which occurred in 1648, going all the way till the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and its thought processes were taken from the ideas of John Calvin. And later that the English Church became Anglican. It was also part of the broader Protestant movement, the broader Reformation of Christianity. And the third great battle was, of course, the French Revolution, which held on to materialist ideas, deistic ideas, and also rationalist ideas. These are the three decisive battles that Engels is going to talk about. If you look at the dates here, this one begins in Germany all the way in the 16th century, and then it goes to England, and from England it goes to France. And that ends up in the late 18th century, almost in the 19th century. So if you look at the expanse of this is 150, almost 200 years of history in which feudalism is slowly being destroyed across Europe. And how that happens is in these three large, massive waves in which the bourgeoisie is attacking feudalism. Here's a beautiful image of Luther with the Protestant Reformation. Let's have a look at what that was all about. So this is Martin Luther, who inspired two of the very important revolts. The first was the revolts of the Germanic nobility against the Catholic Church, Franz von Sickingen in 1523. And secondly, his writing also inspired the peasant wars in Germany in 1525, although he personally then turned against the peasant wars and was against the peasants, and all that they were doing. But his writings really form the foundation of what we refer to as the German or Protestant Reformation. Now, this was a violent Protestant revolt. It was violent in the sense that they had to fight against the church. The church also fought back, and there was war. And in fact, war plagued the European continent as a whole. Religious wars, wars between the Protestants and the Catholics, etc., after the Reformation continued for quite some time until 1648, which is then the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia, which ushers in an entirely different kind of state system. So this is, if you study international relations, everybody talks about the Magna Carta and the Treaty of Westphalia and what happened in the middle, etc., and so on. So the Protestant Reformation is a key element in the conflict that emerges across Europe in this period, in the 16th and 17th century, which results finally in the Treaty of Westphalia. It is the spark that really ignites the whole thing. But the Protestant Reformation was not successful. What was it first and foremost? Well, Luther was a devout Catholic, and when he went to Rome to do pilgrimage and to go to the center of Christianity and to see the Catholic Church, he was appalled by what he saw. The Catholic Church still is now an institution like you have never seen. First of all, it's a European-wide institution. It's centered in Rome, but it's all across Europe. Secondly, it has to be one of the most well-organized hierarchical institutions that you can think of in history. It's like a state. It's like a government. Thirdly, because of its vast scale and size and control over land in the form of various churches and the lands that were attached to those churches, it also has incredible amounts of revenue and wealth at its disposal. In fact, when I went to the Vatican, if you go to the Museum of the Vatican there, I've never seen a museum like that, with things from all over the world, from Egypt, from North Africa, from all over Europe, from ancient Greece, etc., etc. It's remarkable. It is truly remarkable. And there is no institution, for example, in Islam that quite compares to the power and hierarchy of the Catholic Church, etc. So when Luther, by the time that Luther went to the Catholic Church, went to Rome, Rome was not only incredibly rich, but it had also become incredibly corrupt. It had become incredibly corrupt, and it had become, how should I say, mired in many, many different controversies. One of the key controversies, in fact, was an attempt that the Catholic Church was making to build a basilica, Peter's Basilica, for which they had a system called indulgences. So even in our slang we say, "Oh, indulge me," right? What was an indulgence? An indulgence was that they would go to rich people, these fathers, etc., priests, would go to rich people and they would say to them, if you give a certain amount of money to the Catholic Church, which is of course the representation of Christ on earth, if you give a certain amount of money, your sins will be forgiven and you will be able to go to heaven. Because you've done a good thing, because you've supported the church. So aapko sawab milega iska. So people used to then buy those indulgences and try and wipe their slate of sins clean. But as you can imagine, poor people didn't like this at all. They hated it, in fact. Why? Because The Catholic Church and Christianity had always said things like, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. The meek shall inherit the earth, the poor shall inherit the earth. So Jesus Christ was considered very much to be a figure who stood for the marginalized, the poor, the oppressed, and so on. And yet the church had not only become super rich, it had become, in a certain sense, the biggest feudal lord in Europe. But also now, it was very much enmeshed with the political system, and it was giving these indulgences to the rich people. So what did the poor people think of these indulgences? They thought, well, in this life, I have a terrible, horrible life. But now what do I discover? That although I thought that in the afterlife, if I've been good and pure, I would go to heaven, and this rich landlord who's been exploiting me and my family for generations, he will go to hell. But now what do I discover? That the landlord can buy his way through his wealth into heaven. He can buy his way into heaven on the back of the labor, the work that I have done. He has made all that money by exploiting me, and by exploiting me, he's going to use that money. He's going to go to heaven. So you can imagine that the poor peasants were appalled by how these indulgences were being sold by the Catholic Church. And this was one of the key things that started the Protestant Reformation. When Luther went back to his native town in Germany, he wrote down 99 different theses, which he nailed to the local church wall, etc., that were calling for the reformation of the church, that he wants reforms of the church. And in that he said, we want to go back to the original Christianity, which was truly close to the people, which has been corrupted by the Catholic Church, etc., etc. That started the whole revolt, especially in Germany, etc., and other parts. And Protestantism spread like wildfire. And the Catholic Church tried very hard to control it and to suppress it, etc., etc., but it was not successful. When the peasants revolted, though, the peasants were in massive numbers. And when the peasants revolted, they didn't just want that the church should back off. They also wanted that the land should now belong to them. So they started taking over some lands. And one of the key figures in that was a man named Thomas Munzer. Thomas Munzer is what you would call a Christian communist. What that means is, we are very prone to think of communism as being anti-religious. But Thomas Munzer and many like him thought that the original spirit of Christianity was in fact communistic, in the sense that Christianity, the early Christians did not believe in private property. They would share everything in one community. Nobody would go hungry. Everybody would have enough to eat, and so on and so forth. So they thought that Christ's message was not for the rich and powerful, but it was for the poor and downtrodden. And that its spirit was that the land should belong to everybody. Resources should belong to everybody. The same kind of ideas have also been taken by Maulana Bhashani in the context of East Pakistan and so on. So there's a long trend that starts from Thomas Munzer, goes all the way to Archbishop Romero, etc., called liberation theology. Those people who think that Christianity and Abrahamic religions really came to fight against the rich and powerful and to establish a society without exploitation, in which we would share everything in common. So now this really terrified, you can imagine, the nobility of the Germanic nobility, because they said, well, we said, yes, okay, we'll push back the Catholics and so on, but we don't want the poor peasants to take over our lands. So this meant that Germany itself became divided, or you would say the Protestants themselves became divided, and Luther himself basically started writing against the peasant revolution. Thomas Munzer, sadly, could not win. He represented the poorest of the poor, the peasants, etc., but he could not win, and his rebellion was crushed, and he was also killed. But the result of all of this was that although the Protestant Reformation made a great stride against the feudal system, but it could not destroy the feudal system. The indecision of the burghers of the town led to its defeat. What are the burghers of the town? A burgher is basically a trader. So the traders of the town said, this is getting way too radical for us. So they were indecisive. They didn't really know, should we fight, should we not fight, should we move forward, should we move backwards, and so on. And finally, it degenerated into a fight between the local princes and the central power. And so basically the whole revolutionary project as a reformist project, as a protesting project. By the way, the word Protestant Christianity comes from the word protest, because they were protesting so much. That's the name they got, which is Protestant Christianity. Same with Reformation. They were trying to reform Christianity, so they were called the Reformers. That became known as the Reformation. Now, Marx and Engels write that because of the defeat of the Reformation, Germany was blotted out from the actively historical nations for 200 years. What does that mean? It meant that Germany basically went dead for about 200 years. There was no revolutionary movement in Germany. There was no movement for big change. Tabdili aayegi was not really a slogan in Germany for the next 200 years and so on. They were like, yes, just get on with life and let's not go there, etc. So, in other words, the first big assault on the Catholic Church, or the first big assault on feudalism, actually ended in failure. It did not succeed. But it did create a religion adapted to absolute monarchy, Northeast German freemen reduced to serfs, etc. So Protestantism, Protestant Christianity, though, did manage to establish itself and did begin to question many of the ideas of the Catholic Church. Martin Luther himself writes, "Unless I am convinced by proof from Scripture or by plain and clear reasons and arguments, I can and will not retract, for it is neither safe nor wise to do anything against conscience. Here I stand, I can do no other, God help me, Amen." So you can see that that motif of, that idea of I cannot go against my own conscience, we have seen that repeated in so many different movies and in so much of Western literature, etc. And it really comes from here, from the Protestant Reformation. And by the way, Luther also plays a very key role in the Germanic language. He's the first one to translate the Bible into German, and his works in German, because German language is the language of the peasantry. What do the high people, what do the clerics of their time, how do they speak in Latin? So he translates the Bible from Latin into German. And by doing that, he really causes the Germanic language now for the first time to really have its own, literature. It begins what we call the vernacular revolution in Germanic literature, etc. And later on, the Bible is published by the Gutenberg press, etc., in the German language and so on. So Luther plays a very key role in the consciousness of German society. From here, Protestant ideas travel northwards into Scandinavian countries, Amsterdam and so on, where you have this person named John Calvin, who starts his own view, his own Protestant form of Christianity, which is basically Calvinism. Calvinism was fit for the boldest of the bourgeoisie of his time. In other words, this was adopted by the bourgeoisie, by the traders. Okay? Calvin's predestination doctrine was the religious expression of the fact that in the commercial world, success or failure does not depend upon man's activity or cleverness, but upon circumstances uncontrollable by him. So he gave the idea that there is a predestination, we cannot change destiny, and just like the bourgeoisie knows that in trade what will happen, and a lot of it is determined by chance. Now, why Amsterdam? Amsterdam is very interesting because here is a place where there was not a big landed class. It was not controlled by feudal lords, basically. And since Amsterdam, if you know about it, it relied on the sea trade. So the sea trading merchants became very, very wealthy. And as they became wealthy, they took over that city. And when they took over that city, they didn't have a king as such. They didn't have a feudal monarchical structure. Rather, they had what we call a republic. A republic is a government which does not have a king. So in that sense, God's church was republicanized in the sense that it was now the church was being handled, managed by, it came to represent, and the government came to represent not the landed class, but really the trading class. And so Calvinism was key in that. And so in Holland, they founded the first republic. This is a beautiful, again, painting of Holland at that particular point in time. This, of course, is modern Amsterdam, as you can see. This is a beautiful canal that goes right up to the doorstep of these houses, etc. And Amsterdam prides itself on free market, etc. It says we are the first city to have a pure free market. We have such a free market that marijuana and pot is freely available. We don't control that. And sex work also is completely legal. That is also freely available. They say we have the least amount of laws. They take great pride in that, etc. Now, from here, the Calvinist ideas travel. Look at the interesting arch of the, or arc and arch both of these ideas. In the previous class, I told you about the Renaissance, which starts in Italy. From there, we have the Reformation. From the Reformation, it travels northwards to Amsterdam in the form of Calvinism. And from there, there's nowhere more north for it to go. It comes back down now to England. In England, there is a Cromwellian revolution in 1648, where the House of Commons basically revolts against the king, who is trying to impose all these horrible taxes. Always it's about taxes, it's always about the economy, etc. The House of Commons was an institution made by the king. It was made by the king for the purpose that the traders, who were getting more and more wealthy now, would give taxes to the king. But the House of Commons began to say things like, well, actually that happened in the American Revolution, but similar slogans, that we also want representation. We'll give taxes, but we want representation. So there is a conflict between the two, and Oliver Cromwell in 1648, there is the beginning of the English Revolution. The English Revolution is successful at first. Cromwell manages to take power. Cromwell was one of the signatories of King Charles I's death warrants in 1649, and as a member of the Rump Parliament in 1649 to 53, he dominated the short-lived Commonwealth of England. And so he took power in the name of the House of Commons. The middle class of the towns brought it on, and the yeomanry of the country districts fought it out. Even though the peasantry is just the class that the victory once gained is the most surely ruined by the economic consequences of that victory. But the peasants were so unhappy with the feudal lords that they fought it out. But now something interesting happened. So although Cromwell takes power, Charles's son, Charles II, assembles an army from Ireland and from Scotland, and there's war that follows, and then there's the Stuart Restoration. The feudal lords come back to power. Then there's a second revolution in 1688. Here is Cromwell presenting himself in front of the king. You can see the royal court and what it looked like, etc., just to get an idea of that feudal period in history. Here is King Charles I. He's getting what I call a French haircut in English style. This was the English haircut, actually. Haircut came a little short, and it cut more than his hair, etc. It cut his head. Anyway, the English monarchy was restored in 1660. And the feudal lords came back to power, so the revolution wasn't going very successfully. But then in 1688 is what we call the Glorious Revolution, and this now overthrew King James II of England by a union of the English Parliament. And this is the period really in which you see people like John Locke writing. 1648 is the period in which you see people like Thomas Hobbes writing, and 1688 is the period of Lord Shaftesbury and John Locke, and so on and so forth. Now what happens with this so-called Glorious Revolution is that there is a compromise between the bourgeoisie, that is the capitalist class, the merchant class, and the feudal lords. There's a small difference between merchants and capitalists, but we will come to that later. Merchants become capitalists later. So we'll look at that in a little more detail later. The old feudal barons had killed each other during the War of the Roses. There was a war of succession between within the feudal monarchy, etc. And that had weakened feudalism in England. So their successors fully understood the value of money and were far more bourgeois in their habits and tendencies. Yani the feudal aristocracy had ceased really being feudal in that sense, in the old sense, and they were becoming more and more enmeshed with money, etc. Henry VIII's confiscation of church lands created new bourgeois whole scale. So this is called the Tudor Reformation, and this is much earlier, in fact, in which Henry VIII, who didn't want to stay with Catherine, who was the Queen of Spain, Princess of Spain, etc. He didn't want to be married to her anymore. Catherine was his elder brother's wife. His elder brother died, and so then he married her, etc. But he didn't want to be married to her, so he wanted to be married to Anne Boleyn, and who belonged to the merchant class. She wasn't nobility. but he married her, etc. Then he got tired of Anne Boleyn, so then he gave her a French haircut. Then he married another woman, then he didn't like her, and he continued doing that for a while. I have to say he had many wives, and many of the wives, instead of divorcing them, he had them beheaded. When he was doing this, he went up against the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church excommunicated him. He said, okay, you're not going to keep me as part of your church, I'll make my own church. So he had already made what we call the Anglican Church, and this was one of the key things. The other key things was, of course, as always, giving money to the Catholic Church, giving taxes. Now what happened in 1688 is that with the second revolution against the monarchy, the feudal lords and the bourgeoisie came to an agreement. How did they come to this agreement? They came to this agreement because, as I've explained, the feudal lords already were quite weakened by the War of the Roses, by the development of trade, by the Tudor Reformation, and also by, of course, the revolt of 1648. So they said, listen, we don't want to fight anymore. Let's just agree to work together somehow or the other. You will have final authority. The House of Commons will have final authority, but we will also have a king. The king will be constrained by a constitution. So this arrangement is what we call a constitutional monarchy. So constitutional monarchies are formed in the process of anti-feudal revolts, when the feudal lords decide that they are going to somehow find a compromise agreement between the capitalist class, which is trying to take power, and the old feudal class, which wants to retain some element of power. So the English bourgeoisie now becomes part of the ruling class. Originally, the merchants are not part of the ruling class. The English merchant is very happy. The East India Company folks, etc., they are also part of the royal class, and they love their aristocrats. Okay, an aristocrat is basically the feudal lord. They love the mannerisms of the aristocrats, the new bourgeois class who are merchants. Merchants back in that day were rough and tough kind of people. They traveled on ships, they were dealing all the time in ports, and they were dealing with all these rough and tough kind of things. They were not sophisticated people, okay? They didn't know what China went with there. They didn't have the proper etiquette. They didn't know what good dress was, aesthetic sense bhi bada gaudy or whatever tha bas gold laga do. They didn't really know all these things. So culture, they thought, we will learn from the feudal class. The feudal class knows what high culture is. So what happened now here is that there is a compromise agreement. The English bourgeoisie now had to take a part in keeping down the lower orders, the great producing mass of the nation, and one of the means employed for that purpose was the influence of religion. So the English bourgeoisie now looks upon the entire setup of the nobility and aristocracy with great reverence and awe, and understands that religion is very, very important because it's going to play a key role in keeping people suppressed and keeping people down, and so on. The other very interesting thing about this period is that already in England, under the influence of Mr. Thomas Hobbes, you have the development of materialist ideas, mechanistic materialist ideas. If you read Thomas Hobbes, you realize that Hobbes, although he refers to providence and God here and there, etc., but the whole argument has nothing to do with divinity at all. It all rests on this idea of the state of nature versus creating a state, and therefore a social contract between the state and citizens, and so on, right? So the whole basis of Hobbes, the whole argument, the whole epistemology, in fact, of Hobbes is entirely materialistic. So in England, there is already a rise of materialism. But here's the funny thing about English materialism. English materialism under Hobbes was pro-royalist. It was pro the aristocracy, because Hobbes himself was pro the king and pro the aristocracy. He was not a republican in that sense, okay? But now, as English materialism travels across the channel to France, it undergoes a transformation itself. In England, the idea was that materialism was something for the aristocracy. The aristocracy would think about these ideas, and religion was for the downtrodden and the poor, etc., etc. But in France now, it gets reversed. Hobbes called on an absolute monarchy to keep down the people. Then you have Bolingbroke and Shaftesbury. They created a new deistic form of materialism. This was hateful to the bourgeoisie, to the middle class, to the merchants, etc. They considered it a heresy, and materialism passed from England. When it passed from England to France, it was blessed with Cartesianism. Descartes, of course, wrote in the French language, And this doctrine, through Cartesianism, as it became central to the French encyclopedists, it created what I captured in the last class, which is the Enlightenment. The doctrine hashed by the English royalists gave a theoretical flag, ironically, to the French Revolution and to the terrorists of the French Revolution, the extreme revolutionists of that period, and even furnished the text of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. So this is something interesting about history, that in one context, materialism and deism can be a royalist doctrine, and yet as it travels through time and also through space, it becomes something quite different. So finally, here is the French Revolution. This is now the third major uprising. The first one, as you saw, in the first one, the feudal class wins, and the rebels, basically, they don't win. In the second one, the rebels, that is the bourgeoisie and the feudal class, they come to an agreement. It's like a stalemate. Okay? But in the third one, what happens is that the feudal class is decisively defeated. And that, of course, is the French Revolution. So let's look at what happens in the third uprising of the bourgeoisie. It was the first to cast off the religious cloak and was fought out purely on political lines. That means the English Reformation, the Calvinist state, the Germanic Reformation, all of those were fought on the ground of Christianity challenging Christianity, right? A new form of Christianity challenging Catholic Christianity. But now, for the first time, in France, they said, no, this is not about reforming Christianity. We are part of the Enlightenment, and we are entering into a new age, the age of reason. The basis of the French Revolution is not that we are suggesting that Christianity has gone astray, but they're like, no, we are going to create a new society based on what? On rationality and reason. This is a very radical and different ideas. It was the first to be fought up to the destruction of one of the combatants, the aristocracy, and the complete triumph of the other, the bourgeoisie. So this was a decisive struggle. It didn't end in stalemate. It ended in the complete defeat of feudalism. In France, the revolution constituted a complete breach with the traditions of the past. It cleared out the very last vestiges of feudalism and created the Code Civil, which is the Civil Code, which is a new constitution entirely. So it really was quite unique in European history, what the French Revolution did till that particular point in time, and even afterwards, you'll see that the French Revolution is quite unique and really set the tone for the next 200 years of European history. But after the French Revolution, there were the French Revolutionary Wars, because all the monarchies of Europe got together to snuff out the French Revolution. And they all put together their armies, and they fought the French, and the French defeated all of them. Under whose leadership? Napoleon Bonaparte's leadership. So the French Revolution now gave the English a splendid opportunity, with the help of the continental monarchies, to destroy French maritime commerce, to annex French colonies, and to crush the last French pretensions to maritime rivalry. The English were very happy. They were like, yes, we're going to join up with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with the Russians and everybody. I'm going to crush the French, etc., once and for all, because we hate them. Why do we hate them? Because we have a maritime rivalry with them, right? And so that went on for a while, etc. In fact, after the French Revolution, after Napoleon in 1815, the Bourbon dynasty came back to power, and they stayed in power for another 15 years. In other words, the feudals came back to power. They tried very, very hard to restore their rule, etc., but they were extremely unpopular. Then in 1830, there was another revolution against them, and then they were overthrown. And then in 1848, there was another revolution yet again, and so on. So the French Revolution really starts in 1789, but it has to fight and continuously fight in order for its survival until it wipes out feudalism. What about the English reaction to the French Revolution? They hated it. Mostly the English thought, oh my God, look at these crazy French people. What are they doing? They're going towards materialism, they're going towards terrorism, they're going towards mob rule, etc., etc. The British bourgeois felt the aristocracy taught him manners, invented fashions, furnished officers for the army, kept order at home, and built the navy which conquered colonial possessions and new markets abroad. They looked up to the feudal lords. The French Revolution was too radical for them. The French Revolution threw up, in the process of fighting the monarchy, it created these incredibly radical republican ideas. In fact, it created the first communist ideas, and that was challenging property itself. in the form of the conspiracy of equals. So the English bourgeoisie, which had now become part of the ruling class, they felt, oh my God, all these plebs are taking over in France. We don't want that. We are part of the ruling class. We have to keep the poor people down. We are part of the ruling class now. Okay? So very different reaction because of the very different circumstances now as a class. As materialism became the creed of the French Revolution, the God-fearing English bourgeoisie held all the faster to his religion. So in other words, the English were, relatively speaking, more conservative, and the French were, relatively speaking, considered to be more radical. These are also the two different strains that you see amongst liberals, that if you look at a French liberal, the French liberal is going to be much more radical than the English liberal, who's going to be like Edmund Burke and say, no, I think everything should go a little slowly, you know what I mean. But England also made its own French Revolution, except that they didn't do it like the French, they did it like the English do, which is the Industrial Revolution. James Watt and Arkwright and Cartwright, etc., they began to invent all these new kinds of machines, the spinning jenny and so on. And very soon, by the 1780s, a new fever had gripped England itself at the very time and moment when the French Revolution itself is happening, which is a revolution of a different sort, is a revolution in the mode of production. The Industrial Revolution of England is changing the class structure of England. It's making England into an industrial society, which of course becomes very, very interesting because it creates a proletariat class. It creates a class of factory workers, and the proletarians are increasing in number and in strength, in proportion. As industry is developing, this new class is being born of factory workers. And they are going to, of course, play a very important role. Their conditions of life are then captured in lots of beautiful literature, for example, by Charles Dickens in this novel, David Copperfield. Dickens was himself a chimney sweep. He was a working class guy who taught himself how to write and so on. And he wrote about his own experiences as well as all he had seen. Proletariat forced a reluctant parliament to repeal the Acts of Forbidding Combinations of Workmen in 1824. So they began to fight for unions. In 1824, they won the right to create unions. During the Reform agitation, the working men constituted the radical wing of the Reform Party. So the working people were always the most radical out of the liberals, etc. They formulated their demands in the People's Charter. When they created the People's Charter, after that they became what we call the Chartist Party, the first proletarian party, which was a party of basically industrial workers, and constituted themselves in opposition to the great bourgeois anti-corn laws, partly into an independent party called the Chartists, the first working men's party of modern times. Here is a picture, in fact, from the mid-19th century of a rally of the Chartists that is arguing that working class people should also have the right to vote. They are the ones who said, look, you have this parliament, etc., but only those people with property can vote. People without property cannot vote. It was the same in France. It was the same in England. Of course, in the rest of Europe, they didn't even have a republican government. They mostly had monarchies. So how did democracy, what we today call democracy, come to England? It came to England in the mid-19th century thanks to these poor working class people who argued that poor people should also have the right to vote. And Karl Marx, as I told you in the previous lecture, was working very closely with the Chartists. Now, later, continental revolutions in 1848 also began, and the working class now begins to play a very prominent role in the anti-feudal revolts. The revolts are against monarchies and against the feudal lords and against the aristocracy, but while you have a bourgeois class also doing that, you also have side by side with that an independent working class in 1848. And that's part of the reason why the 1848 revolts are also defeated. The Chartists are defeated. The Paris working men insurrection of June 1848 is defeated. There are disasters in 1849 in Italy, Hungary, South Germany. And lastly, the victory of Louis Bonaparte over Paris in 1851. 1848, of course, is the date. These are the barricades of 1848. As you can see, this is where they fought it out, the revolutionaries and the state, etc. And 1848, of course, is also the date when Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto. What happens? The English bourgeoisie support for religion is in order to quell the revolts. And now they say we need these evangelizing of the lower orders. We need to teach them religion. They appealed to Brother Jonathan, the greatest organizer in existence of a religion as a trade, and imported from America revivalism, Moody and Sankey and the like. And finally, he accepted the dangerous aid of the Salvation Army, which revives the propaganda of early Christianity, appeals to the poor as the elect, fights capitalism, but in a religious way, etc. So now we see that in European countries, the bourgeoisie was able to hold exclusive political power the bourgeoisie was unable, to hold exclusive political power for any length of time. But in America, there was no aristocracy. So here in America, as you can see, these are the American founding fathers writing the Declaration of Independence. They didn't have an aristocracy. The aristocracy was the English aristocracy. So when they fought against the English aristocracy, out with the aristocracy. So only in America was there a durable reign of the bourgeoisie because feudalism was unknown, and society at the very beginning started from a bourgeois basis. Finally, the British monarchy, the English bourgeoisie are up to the present day so deeply penetrated. I love this paragraph. I thought I'd read it to you because whenever I look at the footage of how the English still treat the royal family, the way they go crazy, he says the English bourgeoisie are, up to the present day, so deeply penetrated by a sense of their social inferiority that they keep up at their own expense and that of the nation an ornamental caste of drones to represent the nation worthily at all state functions, and they consider themselves highly honored whenever one of themselves is found worthy of admission into this select and privileged body manufactured after all by themselves. So anyway, the English thought that they must keep religion alive for the people. The French bourgeoisie did not find this out until they had done their level best to break up religion forever, and I'll cover how that conflict also occurred. And now it was the turn of the British bourgeoisie to snare and to say, why, you fools, I could have told you that 200 years ago.